So yeah, my name's Emma Bergesser. I'm the economic justice lead at Christian Aid. And so I've been engaging very closely with the IMF and the World Bank for I think 10, 12, almost 15 years now. um, Going to the annuals every time almost. So um, so I know these institutions quite well, but especially always having worked at global level. So I'm very keen to, as I said, have more of these types of discussions. So with that, I'll start my presentation. So there's quite a lot to cover. I'll try not to speak too fast for the interpretation, but do wave if I go over time or speak too fast. So I'm going to just start out with a little bit of history, just to point out for those maybe that are less familiar with that so the IMF and the World Bank were both created in 1944 as the Second World War was ending. And at the time, they were both really set up to prop up European powers who were still colonial powers at the time. And so we often talk about these institutions as maintaining sort of neo-colonial power structures, but actually in the beginning, I just wanted to be clear that they played a very direct role in propping up actual colonialism by propping up the European countries economically that were actually really weakened right after the Second World War. So if they hadn't done that, things might have looked quite differently. Then after that, from about the 1980s onwards, their mission turned more towards the global south. And as I'm not going to go through a whole history of structural adjustment programs, but just to as a reminder for everyone in the room, right? They imposed structural adjustment programs in which the economic disadvantages faced by former colonies were really used against them by requiring these Bretton Woods loans that were conditioned on free market policy reforms, also known as the Washington Consensus, right? And so most of those policies, what we're talking about is trade liberalization, so getting rid of trade barriers, privatization, and fiscal consolidation. And so that's really, a lot of the foundation of the sort of neocolonial, neoliberal world order or global economic system that we're still in today, right? That structurally advantages the global north, significantly has deepened inequalities within and between countries, and relies on unsustainable extractivism of people and planet, right? And so there's a lot of history in between, the 1980s and now, which we won't cover in this webinar. But to start giving you the headlines, today, I think that, while the missions and the public messaging of the IMF and the World Bank have certainly changed, I think to very much better withstand this sort of widespread resistance and rejection. If you really focus on the big picture, they continue to be major lenders and norm shapers of economic and development thinking. They are still led by the global north. And that's not sort of theoretical, it's in sort of hardcore numbers of vote shares. The US and Europeans dominate the decision making in the World Bank and IMF. And they still overwhelmingly prescribe fiscal consolidation and privatization to the global south. So some of those really big things haven't really changed that much since the time of structural adjustment, right? So before I get into the specifics of the institutions, I just wanted to pull back this slide that I had lying around because we often talk about these institutions being so-called experts, right, on debt policy or development policy or whatever. But actually, I just want to sort of draw everyone's attention to a lot of their power also just comes from their financial firepower, from the money that they have compared to other institutions. So this is a not a scientific overview, but I've tried to just indicate a little bit to give people an idea of where, for example, the IMF and World Bank sit compared to other development banks. So in 2020, the World Bank, for example, was able to make 157 billion US dollars available, whereas the African Development Bank over here, that was more like 5 billion in the same year, right? So just to give you some sense of the difference of the financial firepowers between the World Bank and other regional development banks, and then also the power of the IMF. So the IMF now has about $1 trillion of financial firepower, which is really, again, places it in a sort of league of its own financially. So just always keep that in mind as we start talking about their so-called expertise, right? So this, I hope this overview is helpful in giving you some sense of the differences and the similarities between the fund and bank. So I already talked about the history. I'm going to start on the IMF side. First of all, because they have very different missions. So technically, it's the IMF's job to basically maintain global economic stability and growth, like officially according to its Articles of Agreement, although it's not exactly phrased that way, but that's the shortcut version of the IMF's mandate. And so it's really important to sort of realize that there's no development in there. There's no human rights in there. The IMF very much does not consider itself a development institution. And so very classically, if you go to the IMF with these sort of development issues, they will say, that's not our job really, right? So that mandate of global financial stability and growth is always sort of there, shaping, what the IMF does and what it responds to. And so, the IMF has sort of three main activities that it does. First of all, and most importantly, it acts as a lender of last resort to governments. And so, as you will all know, those loans come with policy conditions attached. So those are not project loans that go to, for example, the building of a bridge or a dam. These types of loans tends to be fungible. They go just to the treasury or central bank of a government, but in return for policy conditions and especially macroeconomic policy conditions. Then, which is of course where the IMF has its most direct influence, because through those conditions, it really gets to very directly shape the policies of developing countries. It also does something called surveillance, though, which is for every of its members, so almost every country in the world, it goes to that country more or less every year and writes up a surveillance report that is a review of that country's economy, and it makes policy recommendations. And so even in countries where they don't have a loan program, those surveillance reports do actually shape a lot of thinking and a lot of decision making. It's a softer type of power, but you'll see that they're a lot more influential in developing countries than in rich countries, right? And so that's another type of power. And then it also provides technical assistance on a bunch of more technical types of issues. And so with those three types of activities, the IMF really is considered or gets talked about as the expert on basically all things macroeconomic policy and debt policy, right? Just to save time, I'll go straight I'll go straight to the bank for now. So the bank has a very different mission. The bank is focused on poverty, right, in particular. So it's a development bank, and so its job now is ending extreme poverty and building shared prosperity on a livable planet. They recently added that last bit. And what it does mostly is policy and project lending to governments and the private sector. So they do the same type of policy lending like the IMF, but then they also do project lending, which is, like I said, going to a specific development project, right? That you can track, whether that money has been spent in that way, et cetera. And it lends to to governments as well as the private sector. So that's quite different to the IMF. The World Bank is a much bigger beast. It has like more than 10,000 employees all over the world, and it's actually the World Bank Group is actually made up of like 4 different major institutions. So different banks funding different types of countries or the private sector, but then it also hosts like a bunch of other trusts and mechanisms and things like this. So the bank is a much more complicated sort of animal to try to influence from an advocacy point of view. Um, just on the central policy approaches, as I already mentioned in the previous slide. So what's always, the central thing at the IMF is fiscal consolidation, right? Fiscal consolidation, also known as austerity, right? Cutting public spending or raising really regressive tax measures in order to manage debt so that creditors can keep getting paid back, right? That's the raison d'etre of the IMF. And the thing that happens when a country has been implementing those types of IMF prescriptions for a long time, right? What you see is this hollowing out, right, of the public sector, where you're left with no public resources, right? And so then the World Bank swoops in and says, okay, well, if we want to have good schools, well, the government is in really no position to provide those schools because it has no resources. So we have to go to the private sector and we have to privatize those public services, right? And so that's kind of the 1-2 trick that these institutions have been doing for a very long time, and they're still getting away with it today. So what really marks the World Bank's policy approach is privatization, and these days, especially since 2015, is really de-risking and focusing on leveraging public finance to try to mobilize private finance, which has not been successful. So very quickly on their governance structure. So both of them are effectively still governed under this system that's often referred to as $1, one vote. It's a pay-in system where the countries that pay in the most, that sort of have the biggest economies, more or less, get the biggest votes. But actually, that's not really true anymore, because the countries that were there first in 1944, so US and Europe in particular, because they had that biggest voting power from the very beginning, they've been able to maintain their power even when other economies have grown much bigger, like China, right? And so it's really a US European dominated governance system, more so than sort of $1, one vote, I would say. But yeah. If we want to talk about, the legacy of these institutions in Africa, I mean, so there's so much to say. And you shouldn't listen to me, right? You should listen to lots of African authors who have been writing about this since decades, and make up your own mind, really. Just a few things I wanted to point out in that regard is, I mean, first of all, obviously there isn't like one African view or opinion on their legacy. There are certainly people who have advocated for these structural adjustment programs and will argue that they have led to growth, low inflation, et cetera, right? So you have those views are out there. But I think, overwhelmingly, especially if you start looking more at Pan-African and feminist analysis from the continent, and those views, I think, have become much more mainstream, right? The views are sort of overwhelming on the sort of devastation that these institutions have left on the continent. And so one really nice series I just wanted to draw your attention to is last year, Akina Mamawa Africa did a really nice letter writing series. You can find it under hashtag Dear World Bank and IMF, where they had individual people from across the continent write letters, public letters to the Fund and Bank, talking about how these institutions have impacted them throughout their lives. And so you can read this letter, for example, someone saying how disposable they feel as someone who sits at the intersection of being Black, a woman, and of working class, and being stripped of their humanity, right, by the work of these institutions. So, I mean, that's just one example of so many. But yeah, I would really encourage everyone to go and look for these types of works themselves. Two things I can offer just as a sort of big picture overview to help you think about what these impacts are, or what these institutions have done and whether they actually succeed at their mission or not, right? Is the graph on the left is a great piece of research done by Boston University and a few other academics that shows you I'm sorry, the language is quite um not accessible, but what it shows is the level of basically austerity measures or fiscal consolidation that the IMF has been requiring in its programs since 2001. And so if you look at the median, the red line in the middle, you can see that although there have been some ups and downs throughout that history, generally speaking, the line I would say is pretty straight. We like to think that maybe, you would think fiscal consolidation measures go down after lots of campaigning, after economies change, but actually not that much has changed, right, in all this time in terms of the degree to which the IMF requires fiscal consolidation in its programs. The other graph on this slide is a graph about what are they called? I'll find you the name. I'll put it in the chat. It's just escaped my mind. And I'm sorry, it's also a bit hard to see on such a small slide, but basically the countries here that have stripes on them show a decrease in poverty levels since 1990. The countries that are fully covered in one color are indications that poverty has increased in those countries. And so again, think about the mission, the core mission of the World Bank, right? It should be reducing poverty and supporting economic transformation, right, in Africa, right, and elsewhere. And actually, if you look at the evidence of what's actually happened since 1990 till now, you'll obviously see, especially in sub-Saharan Africa, that hasn't worked. Whereas in a country like China, where we see the greatest decrease in poverty, China very famously has not followed like any of the prescriptions, or like classic prescriptions of the Fund and Bank, right? And so, this I always think this graph is quite instructive in helping us think about, what these institutions have done or not done in particular. So yeah, today 23 African countries are in IMF loan programs, which again also tells you something about how much they're able to, how many of them, for so many of them, this is their 20th program, sometimes their 25th program, how much these so-called these programs that are supposedly there to help countries get out of these debt cycles, how much that's actually happening, not really. And then, so IDA is the part of the World Bank that lends to low-income countries. Only 17 out of 81 IDA countries have graduated out of IDA eligibility since 1996. So again, it's an indicator of like how much any of these systems actually transform anything, right?